Welcome, all of you. My name is Christoph Mücher. I'm director of the Goethe-Institut in Boston, which is the oldest of America's Goethe-Institutes. Goethe being our patron, Germany's cultural institution operating worldwide. And as you can see behind me, we are in a historic building, 19th century, which leads us right away to the topic of today, which is history. And I don't know about you, my history teaching at school was learning by heart the dates of great battles. And at the time, we thought this is history. And in the meanwhile, we have been learning a lot that it's not the heroic deeds of heroic, mostly white men that really matter, but it's the way the everyday people live. And this is one of the reasons why we decided to have this project of shaping the past. Shaping the past, the underlying idea is that history is not just objective truth, but it's more a series of constructed narratives. And these narratives from time to time have to be verified and checked and recalibrated. And this is what we trying to do at the moment together with great partners. The partners being the network of the Goethe-Institutes here in North America, Monument Lab, which is a public art and history studio based in Philadelphia. Great partner for that. Hi to everybody from Monument Lab. And we are generously assisted by the German Federal Agency for Civic Education. And here in Boston, we have for many years a strong focus on music and sound. And last week in our conversation, artists and researchers Luis Schuzoke and Emeka Ogbo from Berlin have been presenting and discussing their particular approach to work with archives and soundscapes. Emeka has a long history of analyzing the soundscapes of Lagos, and he brought a very impressive and very touching document of how sound can bring historic reality into our minds. And today we continue the work on soundscapes, and we're very privileged to welcome two fantastic artists and researchers who made various compositions, soundscapes, sound walks. And without further ado, I'd like to hand over to my colleague Annette Klein, who's been carefully organizing this and other events. So thanks, Annette, for your great work, and here's to you.
Thanks, Christoph. And good afternoon, everyone, and good evening to all of those joining from across the Atlantic. And welcome to the second conversation in our series, as Christoph just said, which is called Listening to History. I'd like to introduce our wonderful speakers, do work with soundscapes and address many issues, including social issues, history in their work. And I think, as you'll see with their presentations, that they have different approaches, which will be really interesting to see. Yvette Janine Jackson is joining us from Cambridge. She is a composer of electroacoustic, chamber, and orchestral music, and often a combination of those. She is also a sound installation artist, and her work is performed in concert venues, part of theater works, and in art installations. And building on her experience as a theatrical sound designer, she blends various forms into her own aesthetic of narrative soundscape composition, radio opera, and improvisation. Her works are created as immersive experiences and engage the audience in difficult conversations that often draw from history to examine relevant social issues. Her work has been featured at many prominent festivals around the world, and she has collaborated internationally with orchestras, ensembles, galleries, theaters, electroacoustic music institutions, and more. And she's also the recipient of numerous international awards and fellowships. And since the fall of 2019, we are very lucky to have Yvette in town. She is assistant professor in creative practice and critical inquiry in the Department of Music at Harvard University, and also teaches in the theater, dance, and media program there. And I recommend going to her website. There's lots of samples of her music there, and you can learn about her projects. Jacek Smolicki is joining us from Vancouver today, although he is a Polish national. And he is an interdisciplinary artist, designer, researcher, and sound walker interested in attending to and recording the diversity of human and other than human realms and existences. In his design and art practice, besides working with existing documents, archives, and heritage, Jacek develops new modes of sensing, recording, para-archiving, and mediating memories, stories, and signals from various sites, scales, and temporalities. His work is manifested through soundscape compositions, sound walks, site-responsive performances, experimental archives, audiovisual installations, and diverse forms of writing. As you can see, he's very active and has a lot going on, and he is exhibited internationally as well and performed, and is presently conducting postdoctoral research, which is funded by the Swedish Research Agency. And in his case as well, his website, he has beautifully laid out his projects and is sharing his current ones. So we'd like to start this conversation with each of our guests giving us about 10 minutes of input from their practice. And we will start with Yvette, and I'll hand over to you, Yvette.
All right, thank you, Annette, for that introduction, and to the Goethe-Institut Boston for allowing me this opportunity to share my work with a new audience. I'll begin with a brief introduction and just covering a quick overview of the history of soundscapes and soundscape composition, and I'll borrow some text from recent writing of mine on narrative soundscape composition, taken from Between the Tracks, Musicians on Selected Electronic Music. And then I will play Swan and have us listen together in preparation for the conversation. So a little bit of historical context about soundscapes. In 1968, R. Murray Schafer brought attention to the concept of the soundscape in his book, The New Soundscape, and again in 1977 in The Tuning of the World. And Schafer encouraged readers to listen to the world as a macrocosmic composition. His ideas both influenced and developed alongside other participants in the World Soundscape Project at Simon Fraser University, including Hildegard Westerkamp and Barry Truax. The World Soundscape Project flourished through the late 60s and 1970s. It was established as a research whose combined efforts helped to propel the field of acoustic ecology. The group's activities and educational goals progressed from archival site-specific documentation to creative recordings and compositions. Schafer spearheaded the group's first major study of locale with the recording of the Vancouver Soundscape in 1973, which used source materials recorded around the Vancouver area. The World Soundscape Project was initially focused on bringing awareness to the environment and mitigating the negative impacts of our changing world. And at the outset, students were enthusiastic about bringing awareness to the soundscape and environmental issues, but were becoming cynical and displaying what Barry Truax described as a, quote, fatalistic attitude that nothing much could be done, end of quote. So to counter this, Truax promoted soundscape composition as an alternative, positive approach to addressing concerns about pollution and the environment. The initial intention of soundscape composition was to document and represent recordings of various sonic environments to the listener, awareness of the sounds that are been ignored, and hence to promote the importance of the soundscape in the life of the community. So in terms of current practice, in the past 50 years, several approaches to engaging soundscape have emerged. In 2012, I began using the term narrative soundscape composition to describe my music and my music practice and my research methods, and I continue to redefine this term of narrative soundscape composition. It expands what the World Soundscape Project in terms of the process of composing the resulting composition to create dialogue between the composer and the listener centered on historical events and social issues. It's a framework for confronting contentious subject matter. And I share the World Soundscape Project's goal of wanting to promote the importance of soundscape in the life of community but I expand beyond the environmental focus and place greater emphasis on the social aspects of community. So soundscape compositions come in many forms, just field recordings of an environment, a collage of sounds that mark time and place, or they can be an imagined soundscape like the one I'll present to you in a moment. I'll conclude this introduction to soundscapes by playing my narrative soundscape composition Swan, which I present as a springboard for our conversation about sounds affordances as a monument of the past and present. Swan begins in the cargo hold of a tall ship transporting Africans to the Americas, and then traverses time and contemplates this question about this elusive idea or notion of freedom. My soundscape compositions are ideally presented in a concert hall or theater with the audience surrounded by multi-channel loudspeakers. The soundscape compositions feature low frequencies that can be felt in the body, and these works are often played in darkness to immerse the listener in a sensorial experience that cannot be conveyed solely through written or spoken text. As we listen together on Zoom, to get comfortable and to listen with your eyes closed.
Thank you, Yvette, for that introduction. I'm still coming back from that very ominous place that I just went to through your work. And I think it was great for us to be able to experience the immersive qualities of your narrative soundscape compositions. But we will actually move right onto Jacek's presentation, which he has pre-recorded in video form, and we will share that with you now.
Material remnants and traces are what dramatic events, such as military conflicts, tend to leave behind at the sites of their occurrence. They constitute fragmented entry points to imagine and connect with the past. While their visual impact, even if fragmented, remains to some degree active over time, their soundscapes dissipate. How would we approach these sites if instead of disappearing instantly, their past soundscapes persisted over time? What if, fragmented and partially decomposed, the sonic ruins of these past events leaked continuously through the gaps and cavities of their physical counterparts? If approached with sonic sensibility and curiosity, do contemporary soundscapes in historically charged places function as gateways to the past and enable another perspective on the present? I propose that with an increased sonic attention and sensibility, soundscapes that surround us can be approached as specific kinds of living and often troubling monuments. That which we hear at a given moment becomes simultaneously an aural manifestation of the present and an echo of the past. Just like images, sounds do not emerge and disappear in a vacuum. Seemingly ephemeral, fleeting, and immediate, noises of today have their sonorous roots anchored deeply in history. They reconfigure or build on that which for some reason has been relegated to the audible past. In places affected by difficult historical events, the present soundscapes seem to camouflage those of the past. They may seem less representative of that which is present than misrepresentative of that which is absent. Such contested sites reject the aural conditions of today and instead remain stubbornly suspended somewhere between the past and the present. The liquidation of the Jewish ghetto in Krakow took place in several steps between June 1942 and March 1943. The majority of its inhabitants were eventually relocated to a forced labor camp, later a concentration camp, built by German Nazis in the fall of 1942 on the grounds of a Jewish graveyard in Płaszów, today the district of Krakow. The profanation and destruction of the graveyard culminated in 1944, when the funeral home, which was earlier transformed into a stable and pigsty, was completely destroyed. Today, the field of the graveyard and the camp remains essentially empty. Paradoxically, most visible are remains from the production set of The Schindler's List, Steven Spielberg's movie from almost 30 years ago, filmed in a nearby quarry. The only real remnants of the original site are the foundations of tombs and a pile of rubble from the funeral house. Over the years, since the end of the war, housing developments in the neighborhood expanded to the extent that their front lines meet the now invisible borders of the former camp. Despite having the formal status of a commemoration site, the place is inscribed by the everyday activities of its local inhabitants, both visually and sonically. Debris such as broken sofa, cigarette butts, matches, and empty liquor bottles can be found among the rubble, and the resulting soundscape is a prosaic collage of acoustic byproducts from the blocks of apartments nearby. Rooks scavenging lazily on the food waste left by the inconsiderate visitors, and wheezing dogs let off the leash by their owners, who stare at their smartphones while taking routine walks on these troubled sediments of history, leaving behind their own incidental imprints of digital, visual, and oral nature. Wandering through this site with binaural microphones and lending an amplified ear to what is there at the present moment inspires me to think of numerous transformations that the soundscape of this land has historically gone through. Predictably, very few accounts of the camp's soundscape survived. Among noises of labor work coming from the camp's workshops, sounds of shooting to the prisoners and screams, one account seems particularly striking. Mamaci, kauf mir ein Pferdchen. The lullaby was cynically played through the camp's loudspeaker system on a day when the German Nazi soldiers separated kids from their parents and sent them to Auschwitz to kill them in gas chambers. With every year past, the number of eye and ear witnesses of this chapter of Holocaust has been decreasing. I walk on the field of the camp in search for other than human witnesses, branches of trees, old enough to remember those horrific days, or at least closer in time to them. I use their trunks and branches to amplify the silence of this place.
By now, his ears are no longer the only organs that let him sense and navigate through the underwater realms. Communities of mussels and barnacles that crowd his body did not desensitize his skin. Quite the opposite. They help him sense the vibration of the environment differently, in a more nuanced way than before. The more time he spends submerged in the water, the better his location skills. By listening to the reflections of his own and other voices, he can discern the arrangement of the entire intertidal zone and even beyond. Every drop, every rustle reveals yet another intricacy on a map that his senses continuously sketch and update. But while this extraordinary sense has been nourishing his bond with the habitat, every such submergence can also be torture. Large mechanical organisms have proliferated in the nearby waters, introducing new deceptive tones. These strange sounds can even be heard in tidal pools that are completely detached from the sea. It feels as if someone willfully added them, like a drop of a toxic mixture that quickly contaminates the entire liquid.
At the end of the 19th century, in their pursuit of control over the territories of today's British Columbia, colonizers deprived indigenous people of their right to engage in traditional rituals that they've cultivated here for centuries. Cultural soundscapes, deeply interwoven with the sounds of natural cycles, have become gradually pushed off by colonial noises. Linearly progressing rhythms took over the cyclic ones, and this dominance still reverberates today. Perhaps one of the most vivid examples of that has been the Canadian Pacific Railway. From that perspective, the railway is no longer just a static infrastructure imposed on the land to facilitate mobility of the settlers. It's a performative action, an array of regularly activated secular rituals in which the act of seizing the land is reproduced in every ride, every clatter of the train wheels, every puff of steam rising from the train's smokestack, and every signal of the train's steam whistle upon the train's departure or arrival. The role of sound in this rhythmical invocation of the superior order is quite obvious. Every evening at 9 p.m., a cannon fires from the bank of Stanley Park here in Vancouver. Cast in England and brought to Vancouver in 1894, this cannon was originally used on Sundays at 6 p.m. to warn fishermen that the weekly fishing period just came to the end. Later, the cannon began firing at 9 p.m. so that sailors could accurately set their chronometers. This practice echoed an earlier one in which the operator of the nearby lighthouse would use a stick of dynamite for the same purpose. This bang of the cannon accompanies many other sounds at once beloved and contested, in which echoes of colonial power still resonate today along the borders of Stanley Park. Gazing at the far horizon of the Burrard Inlet, I can hear a foghorn from one of many cargo ships stationed at the bay. Primarily a communication signal, and for some people a romantic sound mark of coastal environments, this sound also signals authority and control over the waters. A steam-powered mechanical clock in downtown Vancouver is considered as one of the most remarkable monuments in the city. Although built in the 70s of the previous century, through its aesthetics, mechanism and melody, the quarters known from the London's Big Ben, it quite clearly sends us back to the history of British colonialism. While celebrating masterful skills of mechanical clockmakers, this steam-powered clock can simultaneously be listened to as a symbol of violence against natural and indigenous approaches to time that had coexisted here for centuries before colonization set a new tone and rhythm.
Thank you for that really insightful presentation and a little view into the work that you do. It actually makes me want to join one of your sound walks someday, so I hope that can happen. Yeah, I think it would be, we'll start the conversation now. If Yvette and Janine, you want to join me? Yeah, thank you so much to the both of you for your input. And as you're both Soundscapes to take a closer look at history and issues that we face today, and maybe between forgotten, overlooked narratives in history and the present, and very effectively so. And I thought to start off the conversation, perhaps you could both talk a little bit more about your practices in detail, what draws you to working with soundscapes in this particular context, and yeah, what do soundscapes add to the discussion, and perhaps talk a little bit about the process of composing or recording soundscapes and connecting with these very abstract concepts like freedom and colonialism.
I was drawn to soundscapes probably around 2011, and just a brief note on just, I guess, kind of a quick autobiography of my listening practices. You know, I grew up in LA and went to school in New York, and then lived in the San Francisco Bay Area, which you would think would be noisy regions. And then I spent 4 years off the grid in, you know, in nature in the mountains in Colorado, and then returned to, I'll call it civilization for the sake of this conversation, to San Diego, or specifically La Jolla, California, just outside of San Diego. And I found it to be the loudest place I had ever lived. And so I started exploring soundscape composition, or soundscape studies just in general, because I was interested in trying to figure out what I can learn. Well, first of all, why are these sounds affected me in such like a physical way? And I started doing more and more research into soundscape studies, and came across this idea of soundscape composition, which, instead of trying to mitigate the sounds, soundscape composition was suggested as a way of engaging with these sounds and learning about one's environment. So that's basically what drew me into soundscape composition. But I also had a parallel interest in narrative. And so I began thinking, you know, Swan would be the first kind of narrative soundscape composition I did that was focused on a historical event. And it wasn't, I guess it wasn't about trying to exactly recreate that event, but I was interested in just kind of uh, researching through documents of packing human cargo, reading narratives, and trying to imagine what it would be like in that space and what that space would sound like. So it kind of take an historical fiction approach with Swan. And then I began also with Swan as part of a series, slowly incorporating other types of sounds, including field recordings. And I'll just kind of pause right there. There's much more I can say on that, but I'll kind of pause to let Jacek interject.
Thank you. Hi, everyone, and thanks again, Annette and Christoph, for this invitation. Thank you, Yvette, for this possibility to have a conversation. Just like, you know, Yvette mentioned, it's hard to really pinpoint the moment when, you know, when the interest in soundscapes emerged. But there's one kind of experience that I can definitely refer to as kind of transformative, and it was a visit to Jerusalem in 2010, where I was doing a project and also working on it was a collaborative project with the youth in Jerusalem. And on my walks from the hotel to the school, each day I would discover a new sound, a new interesting kind of sonic phenomenon that was reflecting, you know, very vibrant life. I basically realized that, you know, while authorities might be trying to impose different regulations in terms of how to navigate in the city, you know, it's a very dense, politically dense, historically dense place. You have walls, you have surveillance, elements of the infrastructure, or these physical elements of infrastructure are trying to kind of choreograph your movement. And sound was something that was kind of escaping that logic in a way. And you would hear simultaneously, you know, muezzin chants, additionally amplified as a kind of political tool to trespass the boundaries. Then you would hear different, you know, sounds coming from the Jewish district, you would hear sounds coming from the Orthodox Christian districts, and on top of that, you will hear, you know, conflicts emerging here and there, and so on. So then I realized that
what I'm hearing is not just what's happening now, but it's it's a reflection of much more complex kind of historical, material, political, and social process. And that was my entry to kind of explore soundscape as a territory that can both help us understand those processes, but also can be used as a space where we can kind of maybe work gradually towards reconfiguration of those power relationships. And yeah, I mean, since I mentioned walking, that observations happened when I was walking, a very dear kind of a medium in my practice. So I've been always trying to combine the two, the kind of sonic thinking and sound as something that is not necessarily inscribed in place, but it happens as we walk, as we move through the place.
We're both invested in this activity of listening, and so which I found to be one of the noisiest places that I had been, but I also began to listen to types of sounds and began to recognize the patterns of these shifts in sound. So, for example, in La Jolla, California, the types of sounds that cycle through the day include leaf blowers and there's not that much grass, but lawnmowers that just circle for hours. One of the top industries in San Diego is the military. So there's fighter jets that fly over all the time. Tourism is the second largest industry in the area. So there's, helicopters, both, tourist helicopters and also, Coast Guard helicopters. And so it's just constant bombardment of sound and traffic and trucks idling. And I began to recognize these kind of patterns, which also signals to like the health of a location, the economic, in this instance, like the economic health of the area where I was living. And as I said, it really became interesting to me. While Jacek was kind of investigating this through walking, a lot of my research started with doing field recordings from within the domestic space because I was interested in, as I said, the health effects, both physical, physiological health effects and mental health effects of these sounds that, penetrate the domestic space where your home should be a sanctuary, but it's not necessarily.
Yeah, I was wondering, Yvette, if I mean there seems to be a lot of connections between our work, but also a lot of differences, and one of them is site specificity, and maybe also the way that you work with space, or you bring the composition into a place, right, into a specific place, which is this immersive environment, which, as you mentioned and as I experienced, is intended to be usually very dark, with no visual references, whereas in my case, I try to kind of create connections between what you hear and what you see. And I was wondering how it works for you, or if you consider maybe working with your compositions in the context of site specificity somewhere, out of the concert hall.
Right. Yes, I was thinking about that during your video presentation, because I mean we deal with sites in different ways. As you're walking through a place, you not just have the sight and the sounds, but you have the smells and other senses, the feel of the ground underneath you. And what I do with my soundscape composition is I generally invite listeners into a specific space, again, usually a theater, like a black box space, or a concert hall. Oftentimes, I request that the lights dim. I am interested in using darkness to excite the listener's imagination, and curious about what the sounds trigger. So, for example, with the series that started with Swan, during an early workshop, one of the participants said, well, you're never going to get people to know what it feels like in the hull, of a ship, transporting enslaved people. And that was not the intent when I set out to compose Swan. When I do these types of compositions, I am gathering various types of source material. In this case, I have a chamber ensemble, which I use a lot of those sounds to process and morph into sound. I try to transform them into sounds other than what they actually are. And, you know, using Foley, so I'll have like there's the crackling of a radiator apartment. There's creaking of the bedroom door that are all used as a source material to kind of create a different type of sound environment. So when I was getting introduced to soundscape composition, and you know, I thought about these kind of different ways you can approach it, I was drawn to just the imaginative way as a way of exploring history. So you know, each listener is going to have a different response to these pieces based on, you know, their previous experiences, their knowledge of particular subject matter, how they're feeling that day, you know, the space where it's being performed. And my interest of having people gather for collective listening is so that afterwards we can foster conversation on whatever the topic is. And so I guess I'm trying to take them on a walk through the use of spatialization. So before this Zoom conference, we were talking about there's a venue at Virginia Tech, the Cube, which has 140 speakers, and with that, I was able to do an iteration of this narrative where the audience actually could, you know, through spatialization panning, feel like they're moving through these different scenes. And so everyone's gathered together, but going through this space, which they could actually just go out, you know, to an existing space and walk together as well. So,
do you think that sound has this potential to make us look different at things? Because that's how I see the role of you working with aspects of the visual, you know, aspects, as you know, as a kind of suspension of what we believe in through our vision, and maybe, you know, rethinking the way we relate to the world through that sense. I don't know, maybe.
Yeah, I mean,
maybe it's just me.
I think I'm working a lot of the times not just with an absence of visuals, but I mean, for example, with this piece, there's an absence of text as well. And I think that's very important because I'm really trying to communicate to the senses. You know, you have a response. And again, I play this in a concert situation. I mean, you have the benefit. I ask people to idea of knowing if people did or not. You know, on the screen, I have projected this storyboard, which I used as a guide for the composition. And so there's a narrative that I'm thinking when I compose. When these pieces are in a concert situation, I don't want the audience to know too much information about the narrative. Again, I want them to bring experiences, see what the sounds trigger for the listener. And I find that oftentimes when I play these pieces in darkness, afterwards people will share their experiences with me, and they'll tell me, you know, I was listening, I saw, you know, X, Y, and Z, and then their immediate statement after is, have you thought about including visuals? Well, you know, once I include the visuals, that robs the person, the listener, of this opportunity to create these others. And similarly, through the lack of text in these pieces, I think that's very important. It's not present in all of my pieces, but in this particular example of Swan, and just kind of situating. There are human sounds, so there's breathing, and in a sequel to the sound piece, Destination Freedom, you know, it has field recordings recorded around the sand area of both, you know, from the Bay, in addition to sounds of voice, which include, you know, whispered prayers, and, again, breathing, and the heartbeat is synthesized. But oftentimes people respond because their heartbeat will synchronize to the heartbeat within the music, or the that's within the music. And so this is just, you know, one of many ways that I'm interested in just kind of exploring how recreating or composing an imagined soundscape can be used to visit these historical moments. One thing that's interesting, you were talking about, you're listening to historical concept or contemporary sounds in your work that are in historically charged places. And, I kind of a different way of having to use the imagination to travel back into the past. But I would also like to hear more of what you're thinking about in terms of being in a look at the contemporary sounds and how and what brings the listener to the past.
So yes, I think I have to make a distinction between the first piece that you saw, which is Dzielnica, the quarter, which regards the history of the Jewish ghetto, and what I was talking about is mostly the method I use in creating the piece. So I basically start from what's there, what's out there, both visually, physically, but also sonically. And when it comes to the former Jewish ghetto, the only remnants really are the walls that you saw, and then the concentration camp, which was the final kind of station of the design. So I basically spent time there and try to, listen and learn from those contrasts, sometimes drastic contrasts, as you saw with sounds of the playground and the silence of the wall, and try to imagine, basically, like use my imagination to connect. But that's the first step. Of course, there are other layers to that sound walk, historical research, discussions with people who either have memories or are stewards of memories from that period. And I was lucky enough to collaborate on that piece with Katarzyna Zimmerer, who is like she's been working with collecting memories of survivors, but also their families, and she has a huge archive of first accounts, and we are basically going through this archive and trying to focus mostly on those memories that have something to tell us about the sounds of that place that no longer exists. And then we took those portions, and then we used different techniques, both kind of when they were quite verbal accounts, then we would use voices, but we would also try to some extent re-articulate, or I don't want to say replicate, but create some kind of hints, not direct hints, not accurate reconstructions of those sounds, but to give a little bit of a hint to the listener what sounds might have existed. So there was one very important place, which was a workshop that was then turned into a set for prayers. So we recorded some prayers, we recorded some sounds of the workshops, and then tried to create a delicate soundscape that once you step into that place, is kind of initiated in your headphones. And the walk also was constructed in a way that you would have quite dense soundscape compositions during the first 2-3 stations, and then gradually the sounds would be vanishing, and eventually leaving you at the side of the concentration camp with just silence, or those very delicate sounds recorded through the non-human witnesses, as I'm calling them, which is trees, and you with that room to imagine the sounds yourself, instead of providing with a narrative. And that's where I see the power of working with soundscapes, but also working with silence as a medium. That opens up the possibility for the listener to imagine, as opposed to being fed with something that one is supposed to believe to have been a soundscape, or have been a representation of the past. Maybe you can tell me a little bit about how if you work with, because I know that you work with very subtle sounds and a lot of low frequencies as well, which I think leave this function a little bit like a bracket, or one part of the bracket that opens up this room for maybe your own imagination to fill it in. So I wonder how you work with sonic absence, which is silence, basically, as a medium for rethinking history.
Right. Yes. in the past, we've discussed kind of these, what I see as parallelisms between silence and darkness. And so, again, darkness plays an important role in how I wish for people to experience these soundscape compositions. But also, I do think a lot of my pieces are very quiet and kind of ask the listener to strain, one's ear, and to kind of lean in and try to figure out what is happening, which can be frustrating for a listener. But I think kind of these two extremes, initially when I was doing these types of compositions, either with the narrative soundscape composition or what I call radio operas, the directions were to be played at an uncomfortable volume in complete darkness. I think a subtle difference in kind of things that lean toward soundscape composition is that they work with not a complete absence of sound, but again, this quiet that makes you lean in. But in addition, I like to work with low frequencies that can be felt in the body. And I think this can be traced to what I was saying earlier about what drew me to soundscape composition, this curiosity about these sounds that were domesticated or invading my domestic space, where, especially like, trucks and things like that, these low frequencies where even if I were to close the window, I could still feel these sounds inside of my body. That was concerning and intriguing to me. And I think another kind of, for me, that was kind of a negative experience. A more positive experience of these lower frequency and different types of sounds would be found in the works of composer Eliane Redig, where specifically her composition Biogenesis from 1973. The first time I was listening to that at a very medium volume, I began to have a physical sensation from this soundscapes, her electronic soundscapes that she was creating. And I was listening in a supine position, and the sounds made me sit upright, like it was an involuntary response to listening. And so I'm curious about how I can work more intentionally with these lower frequencies to connect the listener to the narrative.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned touch as well, I think earlier, and smell, as always, as elements always present in our perception of sound. And I think this is very interesting, to think of. I mean, I can imagine being in this dark room and then feeling like being touched by the sound. It must be really powerful without really seeing, the source of that which is touching you.
It also brings up the question or the question has been raised to me before of whether or not that is invasive. I guess it was framed as a question of ethics in terms of soundscape.
Exactly. It's interesting because, I mean, if you look at the justification of use of sound in torture, like, in Iraq or in Syria by American troops, they defined using sound in torture settings as a kind of a no-touch torture. And that's why, they're able to do it. But in fact, because it creates, reverberations, it makes your skin, it makes your ear, so it doesn't differ much from the actual physical. I mean, sound is a physical wave at the end of the day. So this is an interesting aspect, I guess, too.
I mean, no touch torture was on my mind when composing this piece. And, tactics that are used in this type of torture, are not just related to the frequencies that are used, but also repetition and volume. And as I said in these earlier pieces, are often, I requested that they be played at an uncomfortable volume. I've backed off from that particular practice. But, yeah, I mean, they're within these soundscape compositions, other things, like I said, of repetition or other patterns can become a part of it. And I think I was also just hyper aware of no touch torture at the time, because as I said, this composition was created while I was living in San Diego, and LRAD, which is a long-range acoustic device, which is used to, it's basically a no-touch tool used to disperse crowds during protests, which cause physical pain and, you know, damage to not just the ears, but, you know, other parts of the body. So to work more deeply with these lower frequencies, or any frequencies at all. I mean, there's also this, I guess, ethical imperative to be very careful. I mean, to you know, there's another aspect of research that I should actually include as part of the composition process. And we talked previously about one way. I compose primarily as a solitary practice, but in opening up soundscape composition to include other people, I mean, I think it would be easier and practical to cover all of these aspects in terms of, you know, is this to the listener? Or, you know, with Swan, I at some point imagined, and I'm still continuing to work with, well, what if I created an electroacoustic piece that considered like the acoustical modeling of a hull of a ship, and the sounds weren't just imagined in this space, but were responding to actual physics of the conditions of the narrative. And so there's many directions in which soundscape, you know, composition can branch out to help with this issue of sound and memory and kind of revisiting the past.
It's interesting that you know, what we are talking about now is basically discomfort that, you know, your composition or my composition cause. And I was wondering if you have ever been accused of putting someone in a very uncomfortable. It did happen to me with soundwalks, and I always announce, you know, the pre-recorded soundwalks are often not to, you know, create a kind of state of meditation as soundwalks typically are, you know, defined as, you know, this immersive experience that connects you with the surrounding environment and creates like, you know, this peaceful condition for, you know, reconnecting with the environment. But in my case, I work often with what Hildegard Westerkamp would maybe describe as a disruptive potential of listening and sound. And there was one soundwalk in Stockholm which caused one person to mention at the end that maybe there should be a psychologist at the end of the soundwalk waiting to have a, you know, conversation, because it was quite, in her case, it was quite disruptive. There were tears involved and things like that. So I'm wondering how it works on your side with your approach to composition, like this, you know, idea of using soundscape composition as a site for reconciliation or meditation versus using it as a disruptive technique.
Right. I mean, definitely with my radio operas, which are text heavy, you know, they have been known to cause discomfort and people need to leave the performance space. I think in terms of the soundscape compositions, I can think of maybe 3 brief examples of the types of discomfort that people have shared with me. The closest thing that I hear that relates to discomfort is people will say that, you know, during the first scene, they feel a sense of claustrophobia as they're listening. The second example, which I'm not sure if it was discomfort because I'm still wondering, a woman, I played Swan at an event at Tufts University a couple of years ago, and a woman approached me in the lobby and said, as she was listening, it reminded her, or the way she phrased it was, when she was in labor, the sound she heard reminded her of what she heard in Swan. So I don't know if that was pleasant or unpleasant for her. I don't know how her labor went, but she said they were pretty close to what she was hearing while in labor. And then I think this level of comfort comes not from the soundscapes themselves that I work with necessarily, but the fact that I ask people to listen in darkness. So oftentimes, people who run venues are who have invited me or hosting events, when I say that I would like this piece to be played in the darkness, they're like, well, you sure you don't want just like a little subtle lighting, or maybe we can, you know, compromise with, you know, just like dimming things. So there's usually a resistance to this darkness, which I'm not sure if in general it's just part of what I think is a fear of the acousmatic. Like we have a fear of just without having any visual stimulation, a lot of us.
I think it's a good moment to have a look at the questions and answers. And the first one is, I think Julia's comment is absolutely right. This is amazing. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. Before going to the second question, I have one myself. I mean, you mentioned sound as torture. Yvette, you mentioned the leaf blowers we're all experiencing at the moment and how unpleasant that can be. If you think about care that is given to the optical preparation of public space, flowers are planted, things are made so that people can relax. Do you know of any examples where for the care of sound preparations are done, where a city council is investing in getting a good atmosphere for our ears, or is it only going to the eyes?
I think there's been attention to sound. For example, cities have tried to use sound as a deterrent for crime. For example, playing classical music outside of certain venues with the idea that it would deter youth from coming and vandalizing their spaces. I don't have the data on how effective that is, but I know it's been done in several cities, both in the U.S. and Europe. Um, I mean, that's the first thing that comes. I don't know, Jacek, what comes to mind for you?
Yeah, I think I'm familiar more with similar examples where sound is used as a masking technique. So it's kind of a post-production, application of sonic thinking, if we can use that term, instead of thinking kind of about those aspects, on the level of preparation or design, which is very difficult, of course, because you can never really predict, what the soundscape, what kind of soundscape will result from your architectural decisions, I guess. So most of the examples, I guess, are masking techniques using loudspeakers. In Stockholm we had several approaches which didn't really work, or were used of time, and then there's this effect of boredom as well, when you hear the same sounds repetitively, especially when you live in the vicinity. Yeah, I mean, I guess there are those indirect techniques that can be implemented, during the urban planning decisions, which are involving, work with certain materials and things like that. And I know that there's a higher consciousness around that growing.
I think also just building on the concept of masking sounds within architectural spaces, I've use white noise, either recordings of them or these types of like waterfalls that produce white noise to provide confidentiality, so people, for example, in the waiting room cannot hear what is happening. The doors, and then also in designing public spaces, having speakers again that play music. I mean, before I gave an example of deterring people from spaces, but also choosing types of music that is appealing to a wide variety of people to invite people into the space. Especially, I mean, if you think of merchants and different types of music being used that way to try to get people to spend their money.
To jump in quickly, I did this project some years ago about the speculation about how future soundscapes of our city might be. And I basically interviewed a lot of people who had something interesting to say about how they envisage it. And one person who works with architecture and urban planning mentioned that there are also those strategies these days to make places in dense urban environments more quiet, for the surveillance system to be more precise, sonic surveillance systems. So this is one, maybe our future cities will go into, designing quiet places, but necessarily for the for the well-being of people, but for the precise ability to target experience, like the microphones installed in public spaces.
Just one last thing on the sound topic. I mean, in terms of, so for example, and I think this is in a lot of cities, when I was doing this research in San Diego, if you look at all the municipal ordinances, there is an acknowledgement posted that says that sounds can be, detrimental to one's health, like certain types of sounds. If you keep scrolling through the ordinances, you can bypass, any of these laws meant to protect people from these sounds by paying a certain, fee, so you can start constructing, your construction sites early in the morning and create loud noises. But I mean, so there is, the cities do acknowledge and they are aware, and I think definitely since the 1970s in a lot of places around the world, aware of the potential harm of these sounds. And so, yeah, it's just interesting to see, harmful sounds in public spaces versus sounds that are being used to for positive reasons, whether it's for commerce or safety.
Unfortunately, they never play your music in the shopping areas, but this is a different story. Annette, you have a good look on the questions as a mother language colleague. Maybe you take over for some very clever and very complicated questions.
Sure. Actually, I wanted to throw one in myself if I could before. Sure. This is kind of a time of reckoning with the past. I mean, we've had, Black Lives Matter demonstrations, and I'd say in the US for sure, but also in the world, about history. And, people are demanding that we question our historical narratives and dismantle monuments and sort of reshuffle things. And I'm just wondering if you have any opinions about how your work could actually, I mean, is it an alternative for these monuments that are very fixed and in a place and not movable, or is this a direct thinking in as a form of remembering the public sphere?
I mean, I've been thinking of like the types of soundscapes I recorded. Of course, the I played for you were all fictitious soundscapes based on history, but I have documented protests from 20 years ago, recent protests, as part of, I guess, soundscape composition. But more importantly, I've been thinking recently about the potential, or the affordances of soundscape composition and how it can be used as a more active tool of social social justice, and not just responding to something, but actually maybe instigating something or calling people to action, bringing people the way that Marie Schaefer was trying to bring attention to the general public about the changing soundscape and the damage to the environment, using these soundscape recordings to bring attention to the dangers of society through listening.
Yeah, I totally agree here with Yvette. Sorry, my headphones are not behaving that well today. Yeah, and with soundwalking, I think it's maybe similar. I mean, if you think of protests, what are they if not soundwalks, right? I mean, my favorite soundwalk is the maybe bad word, but the most inspiring ones is actually not from the field of arts or culture, but it's actual protests that took place around the Grenfell Tower in London. Remember in 2017, people gathered and took a walk around the tower in complete silence. So in my current research, I'm trying to think beyond the artistic realm and seek traces of soundwalking among practices that happen outside of the art world, which is basically in different activist realities and things like that. But also, if I were to answer your question in a more direct sense, I see soundwalking as this vehicle in a way that allows you to take different positions at the same time, to listen to our environment, but also history from different positions. you can switch your perspective. And as I was trying to exemplify with this intertidal room, I'm also including environmental perspective, where you know become gradually transformed into an intertidal species that is no longer a human and perhaps something in between, and you start listening as they hear our reality. So you gain this kind of critical perspective on some processes, and then you're back again, you know, thrown into your human body, and with that additional perspective that lets you, you know, maybe think more critically about, you know, what we are doing to our planet, what we are doing to each other, and so on. And so the idea is that you take your headphones out, you and what Yvette also mentioned in her practice, the dialogue that follows the performance is one of the most important components. And in my case, it's quite similar. Each soundwalk, there's always a discussion gathering where we share our, you know, thoughts, reflections, discomforts, and yeah. And I think that's maybe first step to you know, to think of, you know, how this variety of positions that you just went through can help you maybe, you know, put them in action somehow in your life afterwards.
This year we had a couple of very important historical memory days. We had the 75th anniversary of the liberation of concentration camps. And we were still lucky to be able to talk to people who actually personally lived this horrible situation. So one question by a listener, C. Cast, is in your work, do you integrate people with personal historical knowledge? Is that an aim of your working on the history?
Okay, so the potential intentions for collaborations with those who still have personal historical knowledge. I think that actually connects how Ashik and I first met, or how we first bonded. We met in Stockholm after or before a performance, during an event, and we both were working with separate groups that had the same name, Living Archives, and I think we were each. The group that I was working with was a research group I helped co-found at the University of California in San Diego. And part of that was to work with living people to help preserve, not, well, I mean, this is where the language becomes problematic, but preserve their cultures as opposed to, you know, having an outsider. If you think of a museum, someone collecting these various pieces of art and framing someone else's history, the objective with the Living Archives group that I helped co-found was to, you know, I guess arm people with the tools so they can capture and preserve their own histories and tell things in their own stories and capture their own soundscapes. And I mean, like different a little bit, but maybe add on to that.
Yeah, I think that kind of pertains to the question we discussed last time, which is who has the right to actually record those accounts and work with those groups. Do we need a personal link to, you know, groups of people or individual secure place in history for? But I don't know. I mean, I'm thinking about this dichotomy, which is basically kind of past-oriented archiving, where you, as an artist, as a scholar, as a researcher, as a cultural producer, you go to the archives and you rework existing documents, existing traces, and put new kind of a frame around it based on, you know, what's happening right now. And then there is this kind of future-oriented archiving, which is basically you set out on a mission to save stories that you feel personally or maybe, you know, communally as at risk of disappearance. And yeah, I mean, there are hundreds of projects these days, both regarding, you know, documenting like vanishing languages, for instance, human realms, human cultures, but also a lot of kind of acoustic ecology initiatives that are trying to secure, save, and protect, you know, traces of environments, ecosystems, species that are, you know, at the verge of disappearance. So there's a multiplicity of avenues, you know, that people work with. And in my practice, I always ask myself first that question: do I have a right to, you know, go out and interview that person. What's the connection? Is it really something that I'm ethically inclined to perform, or am I actually transgressing some border that I'm not supposed to? And so I find a person who's worked with certain group of people for a long time and has has built a big trust, and as in the case of Katarzyna Zimmerer I mentioned, or who is actually compiling an archive of those voices of people who were killed in the Holocaust period in Krakow. And then I kind of a connection and offer my expertise quite clearly as someone who is interested in ethical aspects of working with sound, but also honestly have also technical knowledge about how to how to give those voices presence in our kind of overcrowded, technologically overcrowded reality of today.
Again, I mean, if we talk arming or educating or helping people to capture sounds and document their own environment, I mean, the simplest technology that I like to encourage people to think about when listening is just pen and paper, and actually just journaling what they're hearing in their own environment, and maybe even creating kind of a score or composition from the patterns of the sounds that they hear in their daily lives, and just actually learning and reflecting. I think it's it can be challenging to listen and engage in this particular way. I mean, we're not accustomed to it. We're not trained to do so.
Yeah, I think today's problem is perhaps not creating possibilities for recording, capturing voices, but rather creating spaces or situations where those voices can be heard, right? And I think that's, as Yvette mentioned, it's so easy today to create a document of a kind, about visual, image, or sonic recording, but the problems I think arrive when it comes to finding proper channels that can kind of allow to resonate within society. And when I teach field recording, when I talk about my projects, I often try to inspire people to engage in something that I anticipatory second life of the material that they generate, to already think of how am I going to use it, how am I going to communicate it, how am I going to make sure that it's ethically being treated in the future, and it has some kind of a stewardship over time during the actual process of making the recording or collecting material.
Maybe we'll add another one or two questions from the because I think we're nearing our end. Benjamin Elliott has noticed that in your works, both of your works, that you draw from material character of past environments, which might be described as archaeological. So he's wondering, how does archaeology play into your compositional process, and if you make a distinction between archaeology and history?
I don't know if I necessarily frame it well. Now I'm trying to frame it as archaeological research. Definitely, when the process for these compositions tends to begin with a conversation about whatever the subject is, and then I do various types of research. 50% or more of this research involves digital archives. So, for the example of Spawn, as I mentioned before, I looked at diagrams and text advising merchants of ship carrying human cargo and how to cram as many humans into a vessel and keep them alive as you cross the Atlantic. I read related journals, both related to, the the uh, both sides of the from both sides of the Atlantic, I should say. But I mean, in general, on not, I just don't want to limit it to the conversation of Swan. There is a lot of research in terms of it could be narratives, like interviews, oral histories, um, recordings as part of that, and digging through these sounds. So I mean, yeah, I mean, I probably need to think about that some more from an archaeological perspective. I mean,
I worked once on a project in Stockholm, which had this aim to document vanishing soundscapes of one district that was subject to heavy gentrification and is still, ongoing. And I got in touch with an archaeologist who was responsible for, documenting the remnants of this place. They also discovered a lot of kind of medieval architecture that was previously at the site. And in my conversation with him, I mentioned that I'm interested in documenting sounds and different acoustic phenomena that are still present there and will vanish, with the whole process. And he himself told me like, wow, that's an interesting example of sonic archaeology in a way. But then I've been thinking that archaeology is always kind of past oriented again, right? And it has these connotations with digging into the past through the layers of the past, and has also those connotations with heavy kind of material intervention into land. And I think with sound, maybe it's slightly different. As Yvette mentioned, you pursue archaeology of sound through kind of qualitative research, maybe source materials and oral history, perhaps. But of course, like there are examples of practices where people, try to extract in a kind of more poetic way sounds from ruins or different layers, geological layers, and then speculate upon that narrative out of those often very abstract sounds. I don't know if that answers the question.
I also think just of Bruce R. Smith, who I can't remember the title of his book, but he kind of tries to recreate through prose this exploration of Elizabethan and Jacobean soundscapes. And, I think he does that through literature.
And there's one more question which kind of brings us back to the beginning, as Yvette started with talking about noise in your environment, and someone's asking about the emergence of noise as a musical genre today, and whether this indicates something about us as a species, we're becoming more responsive about the meaning of sound and its meaning, or is there something else that you would think when thinking about the noise?
Well, to paraphrase French economist Jacques Attali, the music that's being produced, or the sound of society, are of what will come within society. So by listening to what is being produced, you can kind of peek into the future through that. So that's one perspective on it. I'll just pause there and breathe while Jacek.
I don't have much to add. I mean, I would say that one person's noise is the other person's harmony or silence, and it's a very relative notion, I guess. And it's really hard to ascribe sounds just to humans. I think the noises, sorry, to humans. This notion of anthropophony or anthropophonic sounds, which are basically the ones caused by humans, and they're often characterized by kind of dissonant characteristics or noisy characteristics, versus the natural ones, which are supposedly harmonic, pleasant. I think it's a too easy distinction, and nature can be noisy and and violent in terms of sounds as well.
Yeah, so sorry, I was just going to say, yeah, I guess it also parallels kind of this concept of dissonance in Western music, where we think certain clusters of sounds are unpleasant to the ear, but I mean, really, in the past, over maybe 140 years, we've been trying to open our ears up beyond that and still find, in some circles, find some sounds dissonance, which really it's a cultural bias of what you appreciate in terms of sound. So even when in my own research, when I started giving talks about my soundscape and the noises and unwanted sounds of that environment, I am happy for the people that came to me and asked me to re-listen to those noises and what I perceived as noise. I mean, the noise, the word noise is pretty weighted itself, but and to come to appreciate those sounds in a different manner.
Yeah, I would just throw in one anecdote from my field study in Switzerland. I was doing a little research into music boxes, and Switzerland is famous for production of this meticulously executed beautiful music boxes, very harmonious with beautiful melodies. And I went to a museum which with this amazing array of devices, and you hear this soothing melodies. But at some point, you walk through a workshop, which is like a reconstruction of a workshop where those devices were actually built by like lower class people. And then I asked a woman who was guiding us if she can turn on the machine, produce this cylinder for the music box. And it was one of the most noisiest experience I get in a museum environment, kind of. And then now each time I see a music box, I actually hear the reality of the workshop where this instrument was produced, rather than the soothing melody that was supposed to serve the kind of higher class people. So again, I think I'm writing a little chapter now about how this distinction between the pleasant harmonic sounds and disharmonic and noisy are very relative, and again have their connections with class issues, environmental issues, gender, and so on. So,
very precise. Swiss watches tick along, and before we finish, I mean, we live in very special times. Normally, we would sit in our auditorium and look forward to having a glass of wine with our listeners. It's Corona time, and I think Daniel's question is far too good not to ask it at the end. Do you guys find our soundscapes changed these days? And if so, how does it affect you and your work?
I mean, you had a project at the beginning of when everything kind of shut down, which I feel is directly related to that question. But just in terms of, I will read about accounts of soundscapes, or especially in urban areas, being quieter. And I guess perhaps through my own walking, I would notice these shifts. But I think it was more, again, the connection between the visual and the audio. I would notice visually that there was less traffic, and I don't think I was necessarily thinking about those sounds. But living in the Boston area in September, as the population increased drastically, I noticed I became sensitive to sounds again in the way I had when I was living in La Jolla, California. And I think it was a fear of like all these people outside, just like making noise and socializing, and I'm like, are they wearing masks? And so like the sounds of laughter and voices became fearful for me in a way that they should not be. I think that an interesting kind of change in the soundscape for me.
I think there's some scientific evidence that definitely our noises decreased during the pandemic, including results of like seismographic research that our activities in public spaces decreased, and so the shaking of our planet, even on a kind of macro scale. But I think that perhaps aligns with what you had said. I think our perception of sounds changed rather than the soundscapes themselves, because maybe we started listening and I mean in a different way, maybe perhaps more carefully. I've been encountering a lot of people here and there in the environments who tell me about how all of a sudden they can hear birds, and I asked them, like, are you sure they didn't exist before? Maybe you just started listening to them because there has been this debate about the soundscapes getting changed during the pandemic. So I think it's something in between. Like, of course, soundscapes change, but I think our perception as well, and our awareness, which I think is even more important, and that's something I would love us to retain from this pandemic, to be more sharper listeners in our daily life.
A great sentence to finish out, I think. Not without thanking you a lot. I mean, it's been an incredible pleasure talking to you. and your laughter hasn't been a threat to us at all. Thank you for sharing your wonderful personality, your work, your ideas, and your thoughts. And thank you also for preparing a great finish of this event.
Thank you for the invitation. It's been a great afternoon.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
So the great finish will be, Annette, can you explain?
Yeah, I wanted to
Yep.
thank the two of you as well, because this has been a fantastic conversation. I've really enjoyed it. And I want to thank the audience for coming, that stuck around actually for the entire time. And I want to encourage you to check out the Shaping the Past website, which we copied into the text, because there are additional events. And there will be an exhibition next year. And also stay tuned for more discussions on the culture of remembrance here at the Goethe-Institut Boston. And as Christoph just said, we thought it would be really nice to end this discussion with sound, since we've been talking about sound for an hour and a half. And so we will go out listening to another of Yvette's compositions. This one is from her EP Invisible People, and it's called Hue. It's around 8 minutes long. You're welcome to stick around for the whole thing or sign off whenever you want, but I think we'll say goodbye now and wish you all a rest of a good day and a good evening wherever you are. Hopefully we can all meet again in person.